Welcome to the Sinister Side, the channel where history's darkest, most twisted secrets are finally pulled from the shadows. Before we dive in, take a moment and tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from and what time of day is it right now? Morning, midnight, or somewhere in between? We read every single comment, and if you crave the chilling, unsettling stories history tried desperately to erase, subscribe to the Sinister Side, because sometimes truth is far more horrifying than fiction. Now, imagine entrusting someone with your family, your children, your very bloodline, and never realizing she was slowly destroying it from the inside. This is the hidden, haunting story of the enslaved midwife who poisoned her mistress's bloodline, Charleston's hidden curse of 1844. Charleston in 1844 did not look like a place where secrets could survive. The city stood proud and polished, its wide streets swept clean each morning, its pastel houses glowing softly beneath the southern sun. From the harbor, tall ships drifted in and out like promises fulfilled, carrying goods, wealth, and reassurance that the system worked exactly as it should. Church bells rang on schedule, social visits followed rigid etiquette, everything appeared orderly, permanent, and secure. Yet beneath this carefully maintained elegance existed a silence so heavy it pressed into every brick and beam, a silence built not from peace, but from fear, obedience, and denial. The wealth that defined Charleston came from labor that was rarely acknowledged in polite conversation. Rice fields, cotton plantations, and coastal farms stretched beyond the city, sustained by enslaved bodies whose suffering was transformed into profit. These men and women were visible everywhere and invisible at the same time, moving through markets, kitchens, stables, and streets without being truly seen. Their presence was normalized, their pain abstracted, their lives reduced to numbers in ledgers and inheritance lists. Charleston's prosperity depended on this arrangement, and questioning it meant questioning everything. Public life revolved around appearances. Gentlemen discussed trade and politics over brandy, while ladies planned gatherings and charity events designed to display refinement. These rituals reinforced the illusion that civilization thrived here, untouched by brutality. Behind closed doors, however, control was enforced through discipline, punishment, and constant surveillance. Enslaved people lived under laws that defined them as property, not persons, and those laws were enforced without mercy. Resistance, even imagined, was crushed swiftly. Fear was not an unfortunate side effect of the system, it was its foundation. Within this rigid structure, enslaved women occupied a space of particular vulnerability. They were required not only to work, but to submit emotionally, physically, and psychologically. They cooked meals meant for celebration, cleaned bedrooms for rest, and cared for children who would one day inherit ownership over them. Their proximity to white families created a dangerous intimacy. They heard arguments, witnessed betrayals, and absorbed secrets that could never be acknowledged. Yet they were expected to forget everything the moment they left the room. Among these women, those who served as midwives held a role unlike any other. Childbirth in the 19th century was unpredictable and terrifying. Death hovered close during labor, and even wealthy families could not escape its reach. Doctors were scarce, medical understanding was limited, and superstition filled the gaps left by science. In this environment, experienced midwives became essential figures, summoned during moments when control collapsed and fear took over. When labor pains began, social hierarchy briefly lost its meaning. The woman giving birth was helpless, exposed, and desperate, and the midwife became the authority in the room. This dependence created a contradiction Charleston never fully acknowledged. Enslaved midwives were trusted with the most precious thing a family possessed, its bloodline. They were allowed into private chambers, handed newborn infants, and asked to prepare remedies meant to heal and protect. Yet legally they remained property, denied autonomy and dignity. Their knowledge was respected only as long as it served white interests. Their humanity remained irrelevant. Bloodlines mattered deeply in Charleston society. A family's future depended on its ability to reproduce and endure. Children represented continuity, inheritance, and social power. When a child was born, it was celebrated not only as a life, but as an extension of a name. When a child died, grief was compounded by anxiety. Loss threatened more than emotion, it threatened legacy. For women, this pressure was relentless. Their worth became tied to their ability to produce heirs, and failure carried shame, regardless of cause. Religion provided comfort and justification in equal measure. Sermons emphasized obedience, suffering, and divine order. Tragedy was framed as God's will, a test of faith, rather than a consequence of human action. This belief allowed families to grieve without questioning the structure that governed their lives. Illness and death were absorbed into a narrative that discouraged inquiry. To ask why was to imply fault, and fault was unacceptable in a system that depended on moral certainty. Medical practices of the time further complicated reality. Remedies relied heavily on herbs and traditional knowledge, much of it inherited from African practices. Enslaved healers understood the properties of plants in ways many doctors did not, yet this knowledge was simultaneously exploited and dismissed. White physicians often relied on remedies prepared by enslaved hands while publicly discrediting their origins. Dosages were imprecise, symptoms poorly understood, and outcomes unpredictable. This uncertainty created space where cause and effect blurred into mystery. Inside plantation homes, enslaved midwives lived under constant observation while being largely ignored. They were summoned urgently, then dismissed casually. Praise was temporary, suspicion rare. Their work placed them at the threshold between life and death, yet neither outcome altered their status. Success did not earn freedom. Failure did not prompt investigation. Their role was fixed, their identity flattened into function. Charleston's legal system reinforced this imbalance. Enslaved people could not testify against white citizens. Accusations against them required little evidence, while crimes committed against them often went unpunished. This disparity ensured that power remained unchallenged. It also created blind spots. Because enslaved individuals were presumed incapable of planning or intent, their actions were rarely scrutinized deeply. They were expected to react, not initiate. Social gatherings reinforced hierarchy through ritual and repetition. Balls, dinners, and church services displayed unity and refinement, masking the labor that made such events possible. Enslaved workers moved quietly through these spaces, serving food, pouring drinks, listening without acknowledgement. Information flowed freely around them. They learned who was expecting a child, who feared illness, who worried about inheritance. Knowledge accumulated silently, unrecorded but powerful. Fear of rebellion lingered constantly in Charleston's collective consciousness. Past uprisings haunted memory, shaping laws and behavior. Curfews were enforced, movement restricted, education forbidden. Patrols roamed streets at night, ensuring compliance. This environment discouraged open resistance, but could not erase resentment. Instead, anger turned inward, seeking expression through subtle means rather than open defiance. As 1844 approached, Charleston believed itself secure. Its economy thrived, its social order appeared intact, and its traditions felt eternal. Few questioned the cost of this stability. Fewer still considered that the very people denied agency might find ways to exercise it unseen. The city assumed that control equaled safety, that silence equaled peace. Midwives embodied this contradiction more than anyone else. Their presence was essential, their authority temporary, their humanity ignored. They were trusted because they were underestimated. Their access to private spaces was granted because their intentions were never questioned. Charleston believed it understood them completely, reducing them to roles that felt safe and familiar, yet systems built on denial often fail to recognize their own vulnerabilities. Charleston's greatest weakness lay not in rebellion or violence, but in assumption. The belief that power could never be challenged quietly, that harm could only arrive loudly, blinded the city to the dangers woven into its routines. In 1844, families prepared nurseries and whispered hopes for the future, unaware that something fundamental had already shifted. The city's silence, cultivated over generations, created the perfect conditions for consequences it could neither predict nor prevent. Charleston stood confident, polished, and oblivious, never imagining that its deepest fear would come not from chaos, but from within the very order it trusted. Moschi was never introduced with a name, only with expectation. When the call went out that labor had begun, servants moved quickly, doors opened, and someone was sent to fetch her. By the time she arrived, breathless cries already filled the room, and fear had stripped away the composure of those who believed themselves powerful. In those moments, she stepped forward not as property, but as necessity. Her posture was calm, her movements measured, her voice low and steady. To the family watching her work, she appeared exactly as they wanted her to be, capable, obedient, and utterly without mystery. Her knowledge had not come from any institution that would ever acknowledge it. She learned by watching, listening, and remembering. As a girl, she sat close to older women in the quarters, memorizing how hands moved, how breath changed, how pain announced itself before words could. Birth among the enslaved was both sacred and dangerous because there was no safety net when something went wrong. She learned which plants eased cramps, which leaves slowed bleeding, which roots strengthened weak bodies, and which combinations could bring relief or harm depending on measure and timing. Every lesson was carried in memory, because nothing written down could be protected. When she was first summoned into a white household, she understood immediately that this space followed different rules. The room was cleaner, quieter, perfumed. The woman in labor was surrounded by comforts the midwife herself had never known, yet fear was the same. Pain erased status. In that shared vulnerability, the midwife became essential. Her presence shifted the room. Others deferred to her instructions, even if only temporarily. For a brief window of time, her knowledge placed her above those who claimed ownership over her. That temporary authority was intoxicating and dangerous. She learned quickly how to wield it without appearing to do so. She never raised her voice. She never contradicted openly. She framed every instruction as care, every correction as concern. White women, raised to believe in their own fragility, clung to that gentleness. Trust grew not because the system allowed it, but because desperation demanded it. Once a woman survived childbirth under her care, loyalty followed. The midwife became associated with survival itself. After delivery, her role expanded quietly. She was asked to prepare teas to restore strength, washes to prevent infection, powders to calm infants who cried too long into the night. These remedies were accepted as tradition, rarely questioned. Doctors might glance at them, sometimes even recommend them, without asking where the knowledge came from. The midwife was allowed access to pantries, gardens, and storage rooms so she could gather what she needed. No one followed her closely. She had earned trust, and trust bred carelessness. What made her particularly invisible was her restraint. She did not linger unnecessarily. She did not gossip. She did not display curiosity. She understood that attention was a liability. Instead, she cultivated an image of quiet usefulness. She arrived when needed and faded into the background when she was not. To the household, she became part of the structure, like furniture that had always been there. Familiarity erased scrutiny. Her own history remained unspoken. She had given birth before. She had known the pain of labor without comfort, without privacy, without assurance that the child she carried would remain hers. She had watched babies taken from their mothers, sold to distant plantations, their cries fading as wagons disappeared down the road. Some of her children did not survive long enough to be taken. Their deaths passed without record, without mourning beyond what she carried inside herself. None of this was acknowledged by those who relied on her to deliver their own children safely. Each time she was asked to cradle a white infant, she felt the weight of comparison. These children were celebrated, named, baptized, and documented. Their futures were planned before they could open their eyes. She was expected to nurture them with tenderness while suppressing her own grief. This emotional discipline became second nature. She learned to compartmentalize, to separate what she felt from what she showed. Survival required it. Over time, she began to notice patterns others ignored. She saw how small changes in care altered outcomes, how repeated weakness could be normalized, how doctors blamed women's bodies rather than circumstances. She understood how uncertainty protected those in power. If no one truly understood why something happened, then no one could be held responsible. That realization settled quietly, shaping how she viewed the world around her. Her position granted her access to conversations never meant for her ears. Husbands spoke freely in her presence, assuming she was not listening. Wives confided fears without considering that empathy might exist on the other side. She heard worries about inheritance, about producing heirs, about the shame of repeated failure. She learned which families were desperate, which were anxious, which were willing to overlook almost anything in the hope of securing a future. This knowledge, accumulated slowly, like water behind a dam, white society assumed enslaved people lived only in the present, reacting to orders without planning beyond the next day. That assumption shaped everything. Because she appeared compliant, no one imagined she could be calculating. Because she followed rules, no one believed she might be using them. She was underestimated not because she lacked intelligence, but because the system required that belief to function. Seeing her fully would have meant acknowledging her humanity, and that was incompatible with ownership. Even among other enslaved people, she maintained distance. Her role placed her dangerously close to white authority, and association could bring suspicion. She shared skills quietly, teaching when she could, ensuring knowledge survived beyond her. But her thoughts remained guarded. Words could betray. Silence offered protection. Over time, silence became a habit, then a shield. Her reputation grew without her name ever being spoken. Families recommended her to one another, praising her calm, her effectiveness, her reliability. Each recommendation carried the same assumption: she was safe. She belonged to the system. She posed no threat. That reputation followed her from house to house, reinforcing trust and expanding her reach. With each new household, she learned new routines, new habits, new vulnerabilities. What none of them considered was how deeply that trust exposed them. They handed her responsibility without accountability, authority without oversight. They believed ownership equaled control, never questioning whether control required awareness. In their certainty, they failed to notice how completely they relied on her judgment. By the early 1840s, her presence was expected. When pregnancy was announced, her involvement was assumed. Preparations included her as naturally as linens and cradles. She moved through homes with confidence born of familiarity, unchallenged and unexamined. The system had made her indispensable while refusing to see her as autonomous. In that contradiction, something dangerous took shape. She understood the limits of what could be seen and what would never be questioned. She understood how patterns could hide inside coincidence, how intent could dissolve into explanation. She did not need speed. She did not need violence. She needed only time and access, both of which had been handed to her freely. To Charleston, she remained exactly what she appeared to be, a faithful servant performing her duty. The idea that she might be anything else was unthinkable, and because it was unthinkable, it was never guarded against. At first, the household treated each loss as an isolated sorrow, because sorrow was familiar and therefore manageable. The first infant who failed to thrive was mourned gently, wrapped in linen and buried with prayers that sounded practiced rather than desperate. The family told themselves the child had simply been weak, born into a world that demanded strength from the first breath. The midwife remained nearby during those early weeks, preparing small remedies meant to soothe the child and reassure the mother. Her presence accepted as a comfort, rather than questioned as a cause. When the infant finally slipped away, the household bowed its head and moved forward, believing grief, its LF, was proof of innocence. The second tragedy did not announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, with blood and confusion, and a sudden absence where expectation had lived. The pregnancy ended before it could be publicly celebrated, leaving behind only whispered explanations and closed doors. The mistress was confined to her bed, pale and shaken, while servants moved softly through the halls as if noise itself might invite more misfortune. The midwife cleaned, tended, and restored as she always had, offering tonics and reassurance that healing would come. Doctors were summoned afterward, not during, and their conclusions were unsatisfying but acceptable. They spoke of strain, nerves, and the mysterious will of God. No one asked why. By the third loss, something shifted beneath the surface. Another child was born alive, carefully wrapped, lovingly named, and quietly feared. The baby struggled almost immediately, feeding poorly and sleeping restlessly. The midwife attended constantly, adjusting remedies, calming the mother, and explaining each small weakness as something temporary. The family listened because they wanted to believe. Doctors visited, debated, and left behind contradictory instructions that resolved nothing. When the child died, grief was heavier, sharper, and more isolating. The funeral felt smaller, the prayers less convincing, Whispers began to form at the edges of polite society. Neighbors noticed the pattern but avoided naming it. Charleston valued discretion, especially when reputation was at stake. A family's bloodline was not a subject for casual conversation. Still, invitations slowed, smiles tightened, and pity replaced admiration. The mistress felt it keenly, carrying the unspoken judgment into every interaction. She blamed herself quietly, examining her body as if it were a faulty instrument incapable of fulfilling its purpose. Each new pregnancy brought cautious hope, layered with dread. Celebrations were muted, preparations delayed. The midwife was called earlier and remained longer, her presence becoming almost constant. She prepared strengthening teas and postnatal tonics with practiced ease, using methods that had never been questioned before. When weakness followed, it was explained as evidence of the mistress's fragile constitution rather than a failure of care. The logic reassured everyone involved, because it preserved the belief that nothing within the household itself was wrong. As the years passed, the losses accumulated. Infants who survived birth failed to grow strong. Miscarriages occurred without clear cause. The mistress's health declined in ways that seemed unrelated yet persistent. She tired easily, suffered fevers that came and went, and lost the confidence that once defined her presence. Doctors attributed her condition to emotional strain and repeated disappointment. Rest and prayer were prescribed. The midwife's role expanded quietly, her familiarity with the mistress's body making her indispensable. Able rather than suspect. Inside the house, tension settled like dust that could not be fully cleared away. Rooms once filled with laughter grew subdued. Portraits of ancestors seemed to watch with silent expectation, their painted eyes demanding continuity that reality refused to provide. The master withdrew into work and public life, leaving grief and frustration to circulate privately. When anger surfaced, it found safer outlets. Discipline tightened, minor mistakes by servants were punished more harshly, as if control in small matters could compensate for failure in larger ones. The midwife observed all of this without comment. Her movements remained steady, her demeanor unchanged. She prepared remedies, cleaned tools, and offered comfort when expected. Nothing in her behavior invited scrutiny. If anything, she appeared more devoted, more attentive, more essential. Her calm reinforced the belief that whatever was happening could not be intentional. Intent required visibility, and she remained unseen. Time blurred the tragedies together. Individual losses became part of a larger narrative of misfortune that no one knew how to interrupt. The family spoke less of the future and more of endurance. Hope narrowed into survival. Each birth was approached with resignation rather than joy, as if expecting disappointment might soften its impact. The midwife continued her work within this emotional landscape, adjusting to the household's mood as naturally as she adjusted her remedies. Neighbors began to distance themselves subtly. Sympathy had limits, and association with persistent misfortune felt uncomfortable. The family's social standing did not collapse, but it eroded. Invitations became fewer. Conversations avoided personal topics. The mistress sensed herself becoming an object of quiet speculation, her failures discussed only when she was not present. Shame compounded grief, creating a silence she could not escape. Doctors grew more cautious, their visits more frequent but no more effective. They offered new explanations that contradicted old ones, blaming climate, diet, or inherited weakness. None of them considered that repetition itself might be evidence. Patterns were acknowledged, but dismissed as coincidence, because coincidence preserved comfort. To question deeper causes would have required admitting vulnerability within the system, and that admission felt dangerous. The midwife's continued presence normalized the losses. She had been there at the beginning, and she remained at the end. Her consistency suggested reliability. When she spoke, she did so gently, reinforcing existing beliefs rather than challenging them. She never offered dramatic assurances or warnings. She allowed others to draw their own conclusions, which almost always aligned with what they already believed. As the bloodline weakened, extended family members expressed concern. Some suggested travel, others different physicians, others more fervent prayer. The mistress tried each recommendation with desperate hope, only to face continued disappointment. The midwife adapted seamlessly to each change, incorporating new instructions without resistance. Her flexibility reinforced trust, making it impossible to imagine her as anything other than helpful. Loss became routine. Small coffins were no longer shocking, only heartbreaking. The household learned to grieve efficiently, to mourn and move forward without dwelling too long on questions that led nowhere. The midwife remained present through it all, her face a constant amid changing expressions of sorrow. To the family she became associated not with death but with endurance, the one element that never failed. What no one acknowledged was how completely expectation had shifted. Survival was no longer assumed. It was hoped for cautiously, prepared for defensively, and accepted as unlikely. This shift affected every interaction, every plan, every prayer. The family lived in anticipation of loss, and anticipation dulled curiosity. When tragedy is expected, it is rarely investigated. The mistress's body bore the cumulative weight of these years. Her strength diminished, her illnesses lingered, and her confidence disappeared. Doctors attributed her condition to emotional fragility, reinforcing the belief that she herself was the problem. The midwife tended to her with increased care, offering remedies meant to restore balance and strength. Each treatment reinforced dependency. Each failure reinforced the narrative of inevitable decline. Within Charleston, the story settled into quiet legend. Some spoke of bad luck, others hinted at a curse, though never directly. The idea of a curse was easier than the idea of cause. It allowed mystery without responsibility. The family heard these whispers but could not confront them. To do so would have meant acknowledging helplessness, and helplessness was incompatible with status. Through it all, the midwife remained invisible. She was never questioned, never blamed, never removed. Her role was too familiar, her presence too expected. The system that relied on her had no mechanism to examine her actions beyond surface appearances. Trust, once established, became absolute. By the time the family fully realized their bloodline might not continue, it was too late to trace the path that had led them there. Years of loss blurred into one another, each tragedy obscured by the next. The midwife continued her work quietly, her access uninterrupted, her authority unchallenged. What remained was a household shaped by absence, empty nurseries, unused heirlooms, and plans quietly abandoned. The family endured, but their future narrowed to a point. The losses had not arrived as a single catastrophe but as a series of gentle erasures, each small enough to be ignored until together they formed something irreversible. As seasons turned, the household adapted to its new reality with a grim kind of discipline. Each year brought familiar rituals stripped of expectation. Announcements of pregnancy were made cautiously, sometimes only within the family, as if secrecy itself might protect what openness had not. The midwife continued to arrive early, often before anyone else was informed, moving through the house with the ease of someone who knew every floorboard and shadow. Her familiarity reassured the family, even as it should have unsettled them. Familiarity felt like safety, and safety was desperately needed. The children who were born and lived for a time carried the weight of unspoken fear. Every cough was watched, every fever dreaded. The midwife adjusted feedings, prepared mild infusions, and soothed anxieties with explanations that sounded reasonable and compassionate. When improvement came briefly, hope surged, only to be tempered by memory. When decline followed, it was met with weary acceptance. The family learned to protect themselves emotionally by expecting the worst. Extended relatives began to intervene more forcefully, suggesting changes that might alter fate. Some urged relocation to healthier climates, others recommended different doctors, different diets, different prayers. The household tried each suggestion in turn, clinging to the possibility that somewhere something had been missed. Each change disrupted routines briefly before settling into the same outcome. The midwife adapted without complaint, incorporating new instructions seamlessly, her cooperation reinforcing the belief that she was beyond reproach. The mistress's health continued to wane in subtle but relentless ways. Her hands trembled with fatigue, her sleep remained restless, and her recovery from each pregnancy grew longer and more incomplete. Doctors spoke of hysteria and weakness, diagnoses that placed blame firmly within her body. The midwife's remedies became a constant presence, administered daily, trusted implicitly. Dependency deepened, blurring the line between care and necessity. Within the household staff, tension increased. Loss affected everyone, though not equally. Servants moved more carefully, aware that grief made tempers unpredictable. Punishments became harsher, rules stricter. Control tightened as a response to uncertainty. The midwife, however, seemed immune to this shift. Her role insulated her, granting a protection few others enjoyed. She moved through the house unchallenged, even as others felt pressure close around them. Time altered memory. Early losses that once felt shocking faded into background sorrow. Newer tragedies overshadowed older ones, creating a continuous present of grief without clear beginning or end. The family struggled to recall when hope had last felt uncomplicated. The midwife had been there throughout, a constant thread connecting past and present. Her presence normalized the abnormal, making decline feel inevitable rather than suspicious. Social isolation deepened. Friends who once visited frequently now kept their distance, unsure how to for comfort, without confronting discomfort. Sympathy turned into avoidance. The family's reputation shifted quietly, from admired to pitied. The mistress sensed herself becoming an object lesson, a reminder of fragility in a society that prized strength. Shame compounded sorrow, closing her off further from the world beyond her home. Religious counsel intensified as medical explanations failed. Ministers spoke of trials, faith, and endurance, encouraging acceptance rather than inquiry. Prayer became routine, a ritual that offered structure when understanding did not. The idea that suffering might have purpose provided comfort, even as it discouraged examination of cause. The midwife attended these rituals when expected, her demeanor respectful, her silence reinforcing the belief that all was as it should be. The household's expectations narrowed further. Talk of legacy shifted from certainty to contingency. Plans were made quietly, alternative arrangements considered. The possibility that the family line might end ceased to be unthinkable and became merely painful. Acceptance settled in, dulling the urgency that might have prompted investigation. When despair becomes familiar, curiosity often disappears. The midwife's authority, paradoxically, increased as outcomes worsened. Because nothing else seemed to work, her experience felt invaluable. She was consulted more frequently, her opinions sought with greater urgency. This reliance placed her closer to decision-making while keeping her beyond suspicion. She never challenged medical advice directly, instead complementing it, positioning her remedies as supportive rather than primary. This balance preserved trust. Years of repetition blurred cause and effect. The family could no longer pinpoint when things had begun to go wrong. Memory softened edges, merging events into a single narrative of misfortune. Without a clear starting point, responsibility dissolved. The midwife remained present, but indistinct, her actions folded into routine. What is routine is rarely examined. The mistress's final pregnancies were marked by resignation rather than fear. She prepared herself for loss even before it arrived, protecting her heart by lowering expectation. The midwife matched this tone, offering care without false reassurance. When each loss occurred, it felt almost anticipated, as if fulfillment of a grim prophecy rather than an unexpected blow. Anticipation replaced shock, and shock is often what drives questions. In the broader context of Charleston, the household story became another quiet example of life's unpredictability. People spoke of it briefly, then moved on. New scandals, new successes, new tragedies replaced old ones. The city's attention shifted easily, leaving the family to endure privately. The midwife continued her work within this narrowing circle of concern, her world defined by the house and its recurring grief. By the time the pattern was undeniable, denial had already done it. Work. The family recognized that something fundamental had been lost, yet they lacked the tools to understand how or why. Years of assumption had erased the possibility of scrutiny. The midwife remained exactly where she had always been, her access unchanged, her presence unquestioned. What the family experienced felt like fate, because fate required no explanation. Fate allowed them to grieve without confronting uncomfortable truths. The system that shaped their lives offered no language for quiet intention, only for accident and providence. Within that limitation, the losses made sense, even as they destroyed the future. The bloodline faded gradually, not with a single dramatic end, but through accumulation. Each loss reduced possibility until possibility itself vanished. The household endured, diminished and altered, surrounded by the remnants of expectations never fulfilled. The midwife continued to move through these spaces, her role unchanged, even as everything else transformed. In records and memories, the years collapsed into a simple story of sorrow. Details blurred, names forgotten, causes unexamined. The city accepted this version because it required nothing of anyone. Responsibility dissolved into silence. This slow unraveling left behind a household that learned to live with uncertainty as a permanent companion. Conversations avoided the future, focusing instead on daily routines that offered the illusion of stability. The midwife's presence remained constant, a familiar figure amid changing hopes and repeated disappointment. Her work continued without interruption, framed by the belief that misfortune had no author, only consequence. In that belief, the family found a way to survive even as their lineage. As the years closed in, memory softened into summary. Individual faces, dates, and moments blurred together, replaced by a general sense of loss that felt timeless. The household adjusted its identity accordingly, no longer defining itself by promise, but by endurance. The midwife remained woven into this identity and assumed part of the environment rather than a person acting within it. Her continued access, her unquestioned authority, and her seamless integration into routine ensured that whatever truth, the city moved on, as cities always do. New stories replaced old ones, and the household's quiet tragedy became background noise to larger narratives of commerce and control. What endured was not suspicion but silence, the kind that absorbs details until nothing distinct remains. In that silence, the pattern completed itself, unnoticed, unchallenged, and ultimately irreversible. It ended not with recognition but with resignation, a quiet acceptance that the future would not resemble the past. The household learned to measure time by absence rather than arrival, by what did not happen rather than what did. The midwife continued her duties until she was no longer needed, her departure as unremarkable as her arrival had been. In the end, the losses were recorded as unfortunate events, scattered across years, stripped of connection. The city preserved its comfort by refusing to see beyond coincidence and faith. With no single moment to blame, responsibility dissolved into habit. What remained was a story without a villain, a tragedy without explanation, and a future quietly erased by repetition. History accepted the outcome as inevitable, never asking how patience, access, and trust can quietly destroy legacies. Forever, by the time the midwife's role had reached its peak influence, the household had become a delicate ecosystem of fear, dependence, and quiet desperation. Each day followed a predictable rhythm, the mistress waking reluctantly, the children playing quietly under the supervision of older servants, and the midwife moving through the house with the kind of familiarity only years of uninterrupted access can produce. To the casual observer, life appeared orderly. Meals were prepared and served on time, the house was spotless, and the mistress conducted herself with as much grace as she could muster. Yet beneath the polished surfaces, the household was held together by tension so subtle it was almost invisible, like the thin threads of a spider's web that could snap at any moment. The midwife, fully aware of this, moved carefully within it, her presence stabilizing the environment while simultaneously manipulating it in ways that no one could perceive. Her knowledge of human behavior had grown as keen as her knowledge of herbs. She watched faces for micro-expressions, a fleeting twitch of a mouth, a tightening of the brow, the brief faltering of a hand. These signals told her more than any words could. She understood when the mistress was most anxious, when the master's patience was thinning, and when children sensed fear before it was expressed. This allowed her to intervene subtly, sometimes with a word, sometimes with a gesture, always without seeming to intervene at all. She had learned that power could exist quietly, and that the most effective influence was never direct. By appearing to serve, she actually controlled the very environment she was meant only to exist within. The trust she had cultivated was deep and multifaceted. The mistress relied on her for more than physical care. She relied on her judgment, her discretion, her ability to interpret situations before they escalated. Confidences were whispered in private rooms, fears confessed in soft tones, and the midwife received them all with attentive silence. Nothing she heard was ever repeated outside those walls, yet each fragment of information gave her more leverage. She understood relationships within the household, alliances and resentments among the servants, and the subtle hierarchy enforced by long-standing familiarity with routines. She could anticipate conflict before it erupted, smooth it over without anyone recognizing her hand, and maintain her indispensable role. The family believed her loyalty was absolute because her actions seemed predictable and consistent. Predictability disguised power. Even the master of the house, who rarely engaged with the midwife directly, came to depend on her in ways he could not articulate. He noticed that births occurred with minimal complication when she was present, that children thrived under her care, and that tensions among the staff rarely reached a point that required his direct intervention. He accepted her as part of the machinery of the household, never questioning her motives or her methods. In his mind, she existed as a function, a tool, and that assumption blinded him to the true scope of her awareness and subtle influence. The midwife's own position was reinforced by careful observation of social expectations and taboo. She knew exactly what could be discussed, what could be questioned, and what must remain unquestioned. She listened to conversations between the master and mistress, between visiting families and the household, and absorbed details that others assumed she could not comprehend. Every secret, every plan, every expression of frustration was an opportunity to adjust her behavior and consolidate her position. Silence was her ally, invisibility was her armor. Those who underestimated her never noticed the skill with which she navigated the complex social and domestic structures around her. Her influence extended beyond immediate care to preparation and prevention. She knew which rooms were safest for labor, which furniture provided the most stability, and which remedies could fortify a mother's body before birth. She carefully measured tonics and decoctions, ensuring they were both effective and unobtrusive. No one scrutinized her methods because her success had built an unshakable reputation. Mistakes were attributed to chance or inherent weakness, never to the midwife herself. She understood this and used it to her advantage, maintaining meticulous control over what was administered and when, knowing that timing and dosage could profoundly affect outcomes without drawing suspicion. The household's emotional landscape was also under her subtle management. She could calm the mistress with a gentle touch or a well-chosen word, easing fear before it escalated into panic. She could redirect anger or frustration among staff through observation and small interventions, preventing conflicts that might otherwise ripple outward. She understood the psychological weight of repeated loss and tailored her care accordingly, blending reassurance, advice, and gentle manipulation. In doing so, she reinforced the household's dependence on her presence, making herself indispensable not only for physical survival but for emotional stability as well. This subtle dominance was compounded by her intimate knowledge of every aspect of the household. She knew where ingredients for remedies were stored, which servants could be trusted with sensitive tasks, and which areas of the home were frequently neglected. She moved seamlessly through these spaces, blending utility with discretion. Her actions appeared routine, but every movement was deliberate. Each decision reinforced her value while maintaining the illusion of impartial service. The family saw only a competent and attentive midwife. They did not see a woman fully aware of the levers of influence she controlled. Even social visits and interactions with the outside world played into her growing authority. When other families requested her services, she arrived as expected, competent and composed, earning further accolades. Recommendations spread quietly, enhancing her reputation while expanding her network of access. Each visit to a new household reinforced the perception of reliability and reinforced the belief that she was beyond reproach. By moving through multiple spaces of trust, she acquired information that could be used strategically if necessary. Knowledge was power, and her proximity to the lives and secrets of Charleston's elite provided her with an unmatched reservoir of it. The midwife's understanding of human vulnerability was nuanced and precise. She knew how grief could be exploited to encourage compliance, how anxiety could be alleviated to build trust, and how hope could be manipulated to preserve her authority. She understood that perception was as important as reality, and that being seen as benevolent, competent, and trustworthy allowed her to operate freely within the household. Her expertise was not limited to childbirth. It encompassed observation, prediction, and subtle psychological influence. In every room she entered, she shaped the flow of events without ever appearing to intervene consciously. Her impact extended to the very rhythm of the household. She dictated, without speaking, the pace of activity in anticipation of births or illness. Staff adjusted their own routines according to her implicit expectations. Even minor conflicts were smoothed out preemptively, their resolution often unnoticed because it appeared natural. The household came to rely on her judgment as much as on her remedies, though no one ever articulated this reliance explicitly. Her presence became the stabilizing constant, the axis around which daily life turned. Time strengthened this authority. Years of uninterrupted service, repeated success, and careful observation created a position of extraordinary influence. The midwife knew which interventions could prevent disaster, which warnings would be ignored, and which advice would be followed without question. This allowed her to operate within a zone of near-complete autonomy while remaining legally and socially invisible. Ownership, familiarity, and trust combined to create a rare freedom within extreme restriction, and she wielded it with quiet precision. Her skill at remaining unseen extended beyond observation to interaction. She spoke only when necessary, offering advice or instruction in tones that were neutral and calming. She never corrected in a manner that could provoke anger, and she never suggested actions that might expose her to scrutiny. She understood that appearances could protect her as effectively as obedience, and she managed both with extraordinary care. To those around her, she was nothing more than a dedicated servant performing her duty. In reality, she was the unseen orchestrator of the household's stability. Yet even within this mastery, danger lurked. The social system that relied on her obedience remained fragile, and a single misstep could undo years of careful positioning. Any suspicion could lead to punishment, displacement, or worse. She navigated this precarious landscape with acute awareness, calibrating every action to maximize influence while minimizing risk. Her success depended on the perfect balance of visibility and discretion, action and inaction, trust and strategic distance. Every decision was informed by this constant calculation. The midwife also managed perception externally. When visiting new families or interacting with other midwives and healers, she cultivated an image of dependability and neutrality. She shared knowledge selectively, teaching just enough to maintain reputation without empowering others to rival her authority. Recommendations, referrals, and social introductions were tools she used to strengthen her network and consolidate her position. By controlling the flow of information, she controlled access and influence, reinforcing her indispensable status. Her understanding of timing was equally precise. She knew when to act immediately and when to wait, recognizing that premature intervention could provoke questions while delayed action could yield better results. This sense of temporal strategy extended to remedies, observation, and communication. Every action was synchronized with the rhythms of the household, ensuring that her presence appeared natural, expected, and unremarkable. Through this mastery of timing, she maintained authority invisibly, controlling outcomes without drawing attention to herself. The emotional landscape of the mistress and the household reinforced her power. Repeated losses, persistent fears, and constant reliance on her expertise created a cycle in which her presence became not only desirable but psychologically necessary. The household came to internalize the belief that she alone could prevent disaster, and this belief strengthened her authority. Dependence was both structural and emotional, forming a bond that could not be broken without disrupting the household entirely. Even as her influence grew, she maintained careful boundaries. She never overstepped social norms in a way that could provoke suspicion. Her autonomy was exercised subtly, through observation, timing, and strategic intervention rather than confrontation or defiance. By appearing compliant and unassuming, she ensured that her true power remained invisible. Authority cloaked in obedience allowed her to operate with freedom within a system designed to restrict her entirely. Years passed, and the midwife's position became deeply entrenched. Her knowledge, access, and subtle influence were unmatched. The household had adapted to her rhythms, the staff to her expectations, and the mistress to her guidance. Her expertise had become indispensable not only for survival, but for the emotional equilibrium of the household. Her ability to blend care with strategic control ensured that she remained central, unchallenged, and largely invisible. In all her actions, she demonstrated that power does not always announce itself. It can exist quietly, embedded in routine, trust, and perception. By mastering observation, timing, and influence, she became more than a servant. She became the unseen architect of the household's stability. Her authority was maintained through patience, precision, and psychological insight, and it remained unbroken, for as long as the household tolerated the dependence they could neither name nor question. The mastery of the midwife extended into every aspect of domestic life. She dictated the tempo of activity, the care of children, and the emotional tone of interactions without appearing to exert authority. She managed expectations, mediated potential conflicts, and reinforced routines that ensured the smooth functioning of the household. Her invisibility was her shield, her influence absolute. Each action, each gesture, each measured word consolidated her centrality while preserving the illusion of obedience and neutrality. By the time outsiders or other families encountered her, she had already woven herself into the fabric of Charleston households in a way that rendered her indispensable, respected, and quietly untouchable. Her understanding of human behavior, timing, and perception allowed her to operate freely within strict confines, shaping outcomes, stabilizing emotions, and controlling the flow of life and death without ever revealing the depth of her power. The years had shaped the household into a rhythm dictated by absence as much as presence, and the midwife had become the silent axis around which all life and expectation turned. Every day brought reminders of fragility, children born pale and weak, mothers pale and anxious, servants moving cautiously as if anticipating disaster in every small misstep. The mistress had learned to measure her own body as if it were a fragile instrument, counting weakness, fatigue, and subtle changes with obsessive care. The master, though outwardly composed, carried in his mind a ledger of losses, calculating what remained and what might never return. The midwife, who had long since mastered the art of observation and influence, understood every rhythm and every pattern, using them with precision to consolidate her authority and ensure her control remained unchallenged. She moved through the house like a shadow, present but not intrusive. Her hands were steady, her voice soft, and her presence calming, yet every action carried purpose. She could guide a frightened mother through labor without a single raised tone. She could soothe a restless child with a small remedy or a whispered word that seemed simple yet held the full weight of expertise. Staff deferred to her instincts without questioning, trusting her experience even when it contradicted their own. In this environment, her influence had become absolute yet invisible. She was the fulcrum upon which survival balanced, and no one perceived the extent of her authority because it operated quietly, seamlessly, and invisibly. Over the years, she had cultivated an intimate understanding of every human in the household. She knew the limits of the mistress's patience, the unspoken anxieties of the master, and the fears of every servant, young and old. She could predict conflict before it erupted, smooth tensions before they became dangerous, and guide decisions with subtle suggestion rather than overt command. This knowledge granted her freedom and autonomy within a system designed to restrict her entirely. She could act with near-total impunity, shaping outcomes while appearing entirely benign. It was a mastery of subtlety that few could even recognize, let alone challenge. Her expertise in remedies had grown even sharper. She knew exactly which herbs to combine, in what proportions, and at what times to produce effects that were imperceptible yet decisive. Her tonics, teas, and powders were administered with care, always framed as conventional medical advice, and they were accepted without scrutiny because the household trusted her implicitly. Outcomes that might have appeared suspicious to an outsider were normalized by repetition and expectation. She had learned how to exploit timing, dosage, and presentation to reinforce dependence while minimizing suspicion, a delicate balance that required patience, intelligence, and deep observation. The midwife's control extended beyond physical care to the emotional life of the household. She understood the weight of repeated loss and the psychology of fear and dependence. The mistress's grief could be eased with a well-timed word or touch, the master's anxiety mitigated by demonstration of competence, the staff's tension softened by reassurance that felt casual but was calculated. In every interaction, she maintained an equilibrium that positioned herself as both indispensable and harmless. Her subtle guidance reinforced trust while ensuring that the household could not function fully without her presence. She had become the unseen arbiter of stability. Her influence also reached outward. Families in Charleston began to hear of her skill and reliability, requesting her services when they faced childbirth or illness. She was sent from house to house, each visit cementing her reputation while expanding her network of information and access. Recommendations spread quietly, never boasting, never exaggerating, yet always building her perceived authority. Each new household she entered became an extension of the control she had cultivated in her original space. Her reach was broad, her knowledge unparalleled, and her authority largely unquestioned. Yet she remained cautious. She knew that exposure carried risk. Any action that appeared purposeful could be misconstrued, and any suspicion could threaten her position. She maintained careful balance, operating at the edge of visibility, using observation, timing, and suggestion to influence events without overtly asserting control. She understood human nature, the assumptions of her masters, and the taboos of society, and she wielded this understanding like a finely tuned instrument. Her success depended on patience, discretion, and a deep awareness of cause and effect. By remaining unseen in her authority, she protected herself while shaping the fate of those around her. The household, meanwhile, had become conditioned to her presence. Losses were expected, weaknesses tolerated, and interventions accepted without question. Dependence had been cultivated over years of repeated need, subtle reassurance, and impeccable execution. The mistress relied on her for guidance, the master relied on her for certainty, the staff relied on her for instruction and interpretation. Each individual acted within expectations shaped by the midwife's silent influence, rarely questioning outcomes or considering alternatives. The midwife's authority had become a structural necessity. This authority extended to management of mortality and survival. She knew which infants were at risk, which mothers were vulnerable, and which interventions would succeed or fail. Her timing was precise, her observation acute, her adjustments subtle. Death was a constant threat, yet her influence ensured that survival could often be prolonged or managed in ways that appeared natural. The household attributed success or failure to chance or providence, never considering the deliberate guidance she provided. This allowed her to operate at the center of life and death while remaining invisible to scrutiny. She also mastered the art of perception management. To the household, she was a faithful servant performing her duty. To outsiders, she appeared competent and reliable, nothing more. In reality, she gathered knowledge, interpreted intentions, and anticipated outcomes, using every interaction to consolidate influence. Her invisibility was not accidental. It was cultivated through years of careful observation and strategy. The assumption of obedience provided her freedom, and the trust of those around her provided power. She wielded both with deliberate precision. As time passed, the household's reliance on her became institutionalized. Practices she initiated became standard routines, expectations of care and behavior followed her methods, and her authority over domestic and medical matters went largely unquestioned. She operated at the intersection of NEC, essity and invisibility, controlling the flow of information, care, and outcomes with an almost imperceptible hand. Her expertise in both human behavior and medicinal knowledge allowed her to navigate the complexities of the household with remarkable skill. Her influence became self-reinforcing. The more indispensable she appeared, the more she was trusted, and the more control she accumulated. Her mastery was evident in subtle manipulations that could alter outcomes without detection. She could slow a complication with a carefully measured tonic, redirect attention to prevent conflict, or shift the emotional balance of a room with a few words. Every gesture was calculated, every action deliberate. Yet to the household, these interventions appeared natural, even benevolent. In this way she shaped the fate of the family quietly, almost invisibly, maintaining both her safety and her authority. Her power lay not in overt domination, but in the careful management of perception, trust, and timing. The midwife's knowledge of plants, tonics, and traditional remedies was unmatched. She understood which combinations could produce subtle effects, which could heal, and which could weaken. She administered treatments that appeared conventional, carefully calibrated to avoid suspicion while achieving desired outcomes. Her authority over the physical well-being of the household was complemented by her ability to anticipate and manipulate human behavior. Together, these skills made her influence absolute, even if unseen. The household had come to depend on her expertise, interpreting her actions as faithful service while remaining oblivious to the calculated guidance that underpinned them. Her subtle control over the household extended into the realm of expectation. She shaped how the mistress approached pregnancy, how the master anticipated outcomes, and how the staff interacted with both. She normalized dependence, reinforcing patterns that ensured her centrality. Each act of care, each intervention, and each whispered instruction contributed to a web of reliance that was almost impossible to untangle. Her authority became structural, embedded in routine, expectation, and trust, ensuring that she could act with freedom while maintaining the appearance of service. Even as she extended her influence outward, the midwife remained strategic. She chose where to share knowledge, how to manage perception, and when to intervene. Her discretion allowed her to accumulate information about multiple households without drawing attention. Recommendations and referrals reinforced her reputation while providing opportunities to shape outcomes subtly. Through careful management of relationships, knowledge, and timing, she consolidated power that was both practical and psychological, creating a sphere of authority that was unchallengeable yet invisible. Her understanding of human psychology was profound. She recognized the effects of fear, grief, and hope on behavior. Using these forces to maintain control, she could anticipate reactions, manipulate expectations, and stabilize emotions through carefully timed interventions. This mastery of human nature allowed her to operate freely within constraints imposed by society, ownership, and hierarchy. Her influence was both practical, in terms of health and survival, and strategic, in terms of control and authority. Over decades, the midwife's role evolved into one of absolute indispensability. The household's survival, stability, and emotional equilibrium depended on her presence. Her authority was exercised through subtle guidance, precise interventions, and strategic silence. She navigated complex dynamics of race, class, and gender with extraordinary skill, transforming reliance into power. Her mastery lay not in overt dominance, but in invisibility, subtlety, and the calculated management of trust, perception, and human behavior. Her influence was not confined to a single household. Through referrals, reputation, and her network of observation, she extended her control across multiple households. She collected knowledge, monitored patterns, and maintained discretion while shaping outcomes. Each new environment reinforced her centrality, consolidating authority and expanding the reach of her influence. Her power was both broad and deep, woven into the fabric of domestic life in a manner that made it appear natural, inevitable, and unremarkable. Even as her authority grew, she remained vigilant. One misstep could undo years of careful positioning. She calibrated every action, word, and observation to minimize risk while maximizing effect. Her skill in perception management ensured that trust remained unbroken, while her expertise in remedies and human behavior guaranteed outcomes aligned with her intentions. She balanced authority and invisibility, obedience and influence, safety and power with precision that allowed her to operate unchallenged. By the final years of her service, the midwife had transformed the household entirely. She controlled the flow of life and death, stability and chaos, hope and fear, without ever appearing to assert authority. The household functioned around her presence, relying on her expertise, her judgment, and her subtle guidance. A mastery of observation, timing, human behavior, and medicinal knowledge ensured that she remained indispensable, trusted, and unexamined. She had become both the guardian and the architect of the household's continuity, invisible yet absolute in her influence. The midwife's story illustrates the quiet power that can exist within extreme restriction, demonstrating how observation, patience, and strategic influence can create authority where none is supposed to exist. Her ability to manipulate perception, manage dependence, and control outcomes without detection highlights a mastery of subtlety and human behavior that transcends the limits imposed by society. By operating within the bounds of expectation, while exploiting patterns, timing, and trust, she achieved a level of autonomy and power that few could recognize, let alone challenge. Her legacy was embedded not in recognition, but in the continued functioning of the households she served. Generations experienced the consequences of her influence without ever perceiving its source. Her interventions shaped survival, mortality, and emotional equilibrium in ways that were invisible to contemporaries. She navigated a world defined by restriction, ownership, and hierarchy, transforming dependence into authority, obedience into control, and invisibility into power. Her mastery was complete, her influence enduring, and her presence permanent in the history of those she served, even as her name remained unspoken, her intentions unexamined, and her authority unseen.